The icy rain felt like shattered glass against her skin, but it barely registered over the tearing agony in her chest. Oraya slumped against the harsh cobblestones of the packed square, mud soaking through her thin linen dress. She clawed at her throat, gasping. No sound came out. No scream. There was never a scream for her, just the suffocating silence she'd known her whole life. Standing above her was Caelum. He didn't look like her fated mate. He looked like a stranger carved from ice, his jaw tight, rain dripping from his dark hair. The spiritual tether connecting their souls, a warm, golden thread that had snapped into place just moments ago, vibrated with a sickening tension. He was going to break it. "I can't do this," Caelum said, his voice a rough command cutting through the storm. "I am the Alpha of Silver Peak. My people are starving. We're surrounded by enemies. I need an equal by my side for the coming wars." Oraya reached out. Her trembling fingers brushed his leather boots. She looked up, eyes begging. "Please, I am yours." He stepped back. Her hand hit the wet stone. "A mute cannot rule," he said. The warmth was entirely gone from his tone. The heavy scent of rain-washed cedar and dark honey, his scent, the one she was made for, turned sour. Oraya's heart hammered a frantic, dying rhythm. Beside him stood Alara. The alpha heiress of the Blood Moon pack stared down at Oraya with a venomous smirk, clutching her velvet cloak against the chill. She leaned into Caelum, their arms brushing. He didn't pull away. "I, Alpha Caelum of the Silver Peak pack." The words hit Oraya like a physical blow. She doubled over, clutching her stomach. "Reject you, Oraya the apothecary, as my fated mate in Luna." The spiritual tether violently snapped. Oraya collapsed, her forehead hitting the wet stone. It felt like someone had ripped her heart out barehanded. Blood rushed to her mouth. She coughed, choking on the metallic taste, and spat a dark puddle onto the cobblestones. The rain washed the red away, leaving something else behind. Tiny, shimmering flecks of silver glowed against the dark stone. The anomaly. The curse she'd hidden for 22 years. The silver drops hissed, sizzling hot against the cold rock. Caelum turned his back, wrapping an arm around Alara's waist. He walked away, taking Oraya's soul with him. Heavy boots crunched against the gravel. Rough hands grabbed Oraya's arms, hauling her limp body through the mud. The severed bond had drained the life from her muscles, leaving the world a blurred spin of dark trees and driving rain. "Get up, freak," one of the guards spat, shoving her forward. Oraya stumbled. Her bare feet slipped on rotting leaves at the edge of the territory. The boundary. Beyond the glowing wards lay the Veilwoods, a lethal expanse of twisted black trees, rogue wolves, and shadow assassins. A death sentence for anyone, let alone a defenseless, silent Omega. He tried to turn back. She needed her herbs, her winter cloak, anything to survive the night. The guard slapped her across the face. She went down hard, her lips splitting open. The sharp tang of copper filled her mouth, and she swallowed it fast, terrified they'd see the silver flecks. If they knew what she really was, banishment would be the least of her worries. They'd burn her alive. "Alpha wants the rot out of his pack," the second guard sneered. He kicked her until she tumbled over the magical ward line. "You're exiled. Cross back and we shoot on sight." Oraya pushed herself up on shaking arms. High above, standing on the covered stone balcony of the Silver Peak Keep, Alara watched. Even from this distance, Oraya could see the cruel curl of the heiress's lips as the guards threw her to the wolves. Alara raised a silver goblet in a mocking toast, then vanished into Caelum's chambers. Oraya was completely alone. The guards marched away, leaving her in the freezing downpour. The cold seeped into her bones, stiffening her joints. Her wet dress clung to her shivering frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to trap whatever body heat she had left. Wind howled through the ancient rotting trunks of the Veilwoods, carrying the overwhelming scent of pine and decay. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She froze. The woods had gone dead silent. No crickets. The wind seemed to hold its breath. A massive shadow shifted in the dense tree line ahead. Too tall for a wolf. Too wide for a man. Two glowing eyes blinked in the dark, locking onto her. Oraya scrambled backward in the mud, gasping silently for air. She scrambled to her feet and bolted blindly into the Veilwoods. Sharp branches whipped across her face, snagging her dress and tearing her skin. Mud sucked at her bare feet. She didn't know what was hunting her, but she knew she was dying anyway. The rejection was eating her from the inside out. A burning fever swept through her veins, completely unnatural in the freezing rain. Her blood felt like it was boiling. The silver flecks she had hidden all her life were waking up, feeding on the trauma, violently rejecting her frail human shell. She tripped over an exposed root and crashed into the base of a hollowed oak. She couldn't run anymore. Curled into a tight ball, she clutched her chest as a new, unimaginable agony ripped through her core. It was worse than the severing. Her spine arched violently against the tree bark. Her eyes rolled back. The bones in her shoulders shattered and instantly reformed, expanding, growing impossibly broad. Her linen dress shredded into ribbons as her torso lengthened. She opened her mouth to scream, but the silence held. Instead, a terrifying heat rushed up her throat. Her jaw dislocated, pushing forward into a massive muzzle. Thick, shimmering silver fur erupted from her tearing skin, covering her expanding muscles. The pain was blinding and absolute. She felt her fingernails pop from their beds, replaced by thick, curving black talons that dug deep into the frozen earth. Then the fever broke. The agony vanished, replaced by an intoxicating rush of raw power. Her senses exploded. She could hear the frantic heartbeat of a rabbit 3 miles away. She could smell faint poison on the air, the deep rot of the earth, the terrified sweat of the guards who had thrown her away. Oraya slowly pushed herself up. She wasn't standing on 2 legs anymore. She crouched on thick, heavily muscled limbs, towering over the forest floor. The cold rain no longer bothered her. It felt like a gentle mist against her dense coat. She looked down at the lethal claws gripping the muddy earth. They were weapons. She was a weapon. The ancient Lycan blood hadn't just saved her life, it had remade her. Deep in her massive chest, her lungs expanded, pulling in the chilled night air. Far off in the distance, a haunting howl rang through the Veilwoods. A challenge. Oraya's ears swiveled. A low growl started deep in her throat, vibrating through the dirt beneath her feet. She was no longer the weak, silent apothecary. She was the apex predator of the shadows. And she was starving. Oraya leaped up the sheer rock face of the Veilwood ridge, her massive claws sinking deep into the wet stone. She didn't slip. She didn't tire. She reached the summit in seconds, perching perfectly still on a jagged outcropping that overlooked the glowing boundary of Silver Peak. Far below, the pack square was a distant, flickering blur of braziers. She should have run away. She should have turned her back on the territory that had thrown her into the mud. But the wind shifted, carrying a scent that made her silver fur bristle. It wasn't the smell of the forest. It was a cold, sickly metallic tang, dark magic and poisoned steel. Oraya tilted her massive head. Her new hearing peeled back the layers of the storm, picking up the soft, syncopated thud of footsteps. Too light. Too coordinated. She leaned over the ridge, glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Figures in dark cloaks were slipping seamlessly past the pack's outer boundary wards. They carried no scent of their own, masking themselves in the shadows. Alara's assassins. The perimeter is clear, a raspy voice whispered. The sound carried up the ridge, hitting Oraya's ears as clearly as if the man stood beside her. The heiress gave the signal. Cut the patrol lines. And the Alpha? Another voice asked. He left the keep. He's searching the woods for the anomaly just as she planned. Take him alive if you can. If not, the poison will finish the job. Oraya's massive chest rumbled with a silent snarl. Alara hadn't just stolen her mate, she had staged a coup. She was sending private killers to slaughter the Alpha Caelum had sacrificed his soul to protect. A new scent hit the air. It sliced through the smell of pine and poisoned steel. Rain-washed cedar and dark honey. But it was wrong. The rich, dominant aroma of the Alpha was soured by a sharp spike of distress. He was close. He was bleeding. Her inner wolf snapped its jaws. The mate bond might have been politically severed, but the ancient magic in her veins still recognized what belonged to her. Oraya launched herself off the ridge, diving straight into the black canopy of the Veilwoods. She tore through the underbrush like a silver ghost. Branches thick as human arms snapped effortlessly against her broad chest. Oraya didn't feel the thorns. She only felt the intoxicating rush of absolute power. 3 massive shapes stepped out from the shadows, blocking her path. Oraya slid to a halt, her claws gouging deep trenches into the muddy earth. Rogue wolves. Their fur was matted, eyes clouded with the sickly green haze of dark magic. Alara's pets. They reeked of rot and old blood, saliva dripping from their jaws as they circled her in the gloom. "Well, look at this," the largest rogue snarled, shifting halfway into his human form. His voice was a guttural rasp. "The little banished Omega. Did the big bad Alpha throw you out to freeze?" Oraya stood perfectly still. The rogue thought she was just a large wolf. He had no idea what he was looking at. "Take her apart," the rogue laughed, eyes flashing with cruel delight. "Leave the pieces for the crows." The two flanking wolves lunged, jaws snapping for her throat. Oraya didn't cower. She simply raised one massive silver-furred arm and backhanded the first wolf out of the air. The sound of shattering ribs echoed through the trees. The wolf flew backward, slamming into an oak trunk with a heavy, wet thud. It crumpled to the dirt, unmoving. The second wolf clamped its teeth onto her forearm. Oraya didn't even flinch. The teeth couldn't pierce her thick muscle. She turned her glowing eyes down to the creature hanging off her arm, a low, terrifying rumble starting deep in her chest. She reached down, her black talons wrapping entirely around the wolf's thick neck. With a flick of her wrist she squeezed. Thump. She dropped the lifeless body into the mud. The lead rogue stumbled backward, his mocking smile vanishing. The green haze in his eyes was replaced by pure terror as he finally looked up, realizing her head reached the lower branches of the trees. What are you?" he stammered, scrambling away in the dirt. Oraya stepped forward into a patch of moonlight, her silver fur glowing from within. She opened her terrifying, elongated jaws, exposing rows of serrated teeth. She didn't need words to answer him. She lunged. Moments later, the forest was quiet again. Oraya stood over the broken bodies, wiping a smear of dark blood from her muzzle. A dark, thrilling satisfaction settled into her bones. She left the bodies right where they fell, a violent warning to anyone else who dared hunt in her woods. The scent of cedar and honey was fading fast. Oraya leaped into the high branches, traversing the forest canopy with silent, bounding strides. Below her, the forest floor dropped away into a deep, rocky ravine. She froze on a thick branch, peering down through the wet leaves. There he was. Alpha Caelum was backed against a jagged stone wall, his breathing ragged and shallow. His heavy coat was torn and dark blood soaked the side of his ribs. Surrounding him were 5 of Alara's shadow assassins, their curved blades dripping with a sizzling purple liquid. "Stand down," Caelum commanded. His voice was a desperate bark. "I am your Alpha." The assassins didn't speak. They simply tightened the circle. Oraya watched from the darkness above. A bitter vindication washed over her. The handsome king, the man who had cast her aside for being weak, was completely powerless. He had chosen alliances over love, and now that alliance was bleeding him dry. One of the assassins darted forward, slashing the poisoned blade across Caelum's thigh. Caelum let out a choked gasp and fell to his knees in the mud. He tried to raise his hands, but the dark magic was already seizing his muscles. His head slumped forward. "Let him die," a dark voice whispered in her mind. "Let him pay for the cobblestones. Let him pay for the silence." An assassin raised a heavy blade high into the air, aiming for the back of Caelum's exposed neck. Caelum looked up. Through the rain, his eyes locked onto nothingness. His lips moved in a barely audible whisper. "Oraya." The phantom ache of the severed bond tore through her chest. Oraya stepped off the massive branch. She plummeted through the canopy, her heavy frame parting the branches like water. She hit the ground directly between Caelum and the descending blade. The impact shook the ravine. Mud and rainwater exploded outward. The assassin stumbled back, his weapon halting mid-swing as a towering wall of silver fur materialized out of nowhere. Oraya slowly rose from her crouched landing. She towered over the men, blocking Caelum from their view. The assassins froze, eyes widening in horror. Oraya looked over her massive shoulder at the broken Alpha kneeling behind her. Then she turned her glowing, lethal eyes back to the killers. The hunt had begun. The first assassin didn't even have time to scream. Oraya lunged, her silver frame crossing the space in a blur of unnatural speed. She swiped her heavy, taloned hand through the pouring rain. The blow shattered the man's ribs instantly, sending him crashing into the jagged stone wall. He didn't get up. The remaining 4 killers hesitated, their poisoned blades trembling in the downpour. They had been trained to hunt alphas, not ancient myths. 2 of them broke rank and charged her. Oraya didn't dodge. He welcomed the strike. A poisoned blade sliced across her thick shoulder, but the dark magic hissed and dissolved against her silver-flecked blood. A brief sting, nothing more. She grabbed the attacker by the throat, hoisting him off the ground with one hand, and hurled him into the rushing river below. His armor sank him like a stone. The last 2 turned to run. Oraya dropped to all 4s, her powerful back legs propelling her forward. She caught them before they made it 10 yards. A profound stillness settled over the ravine. The frantic splashing of the river and the steady beat of the rain were the only sounds left. The threat was gone. Oraya stood amidst the mud and broken steel, chest heaving, silver fur matted with dark blood. The adrenaline was a fiery, intoxicating rush, feeding a fierce, protective rage burning in her core. She turned slowly. Caelum was still kneeling in the mud. He was staring up at her, paralyzed. The poison was rapidly draining the color from his face, but his eyes were wide with awe. He was looking at a monster, yet he showed no fear. The scent of rain-washed cedar and herbs hung faintly in the space between them. He swayed violently, fighting to keep his eyes open. His lips parted. "Goddess," he whispered, his voice a broken, reverent rasp. His eyes rolled back and the great Alpha of Silver Peak passed out completely at her clawed feet. The rhythmic, grinding sound of stone against stone echoed through the hidden cavern. Oraya sat near the flickering warmth of a small fire, working the heavy mortar and pestle with frantic hands. She had dragged Caelum deep into the Veilwood cave network, miles away from the river. But she couldn't save him in her Lycan body. Her massive claws lacked the delicate precision of an apothecary. She had been forced to shift back. Her human form felt fragile and freezing. Draped only in a heavy blood-stained wool coat stripped from one of the dead assassins, she crushed the bitter winter root and ashwood bark, mixing it with wet moss to draw out the dark magic. Caelum lay on the cold cavern floor beside her. His chest rose and fell in ragged stutters. His skin was slick with fever sweat, the purple poison spider webbing out from the deep wound on his thigh. Oraya leaned over him, her bare knee brushing his side. The contact sent a sharp spark through her chest. The mate bond. He had severed it, but her soul refused to let him go. She hated him for the rejection. He hated him for the cobblestones. She pressed the thick, wet poultice directly into his wound. Caelum arched off the cave floor with a strangled groan. His head thrashed back and forth. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice caught in the grip of a delirious fever. "Forgive me. I had to." Oraya froze, the blood draining from her face. Was he dreaming of her? Or apologizing to his pack for his failure? She stared down at his handsome, sweat-drenched face. He looked so vulnerable. The terrifying king stripped of his crown, reduced to a shivering, broken man in the dirt. She reached out with a trembling hand, hesitating just inches above his forehead. She wanted to smooth the deep lines of pain etched between his brows. His hand shot out and clamped down hard around her wrist. Oraya ripped her arm out of his grasp, throwing herself backward into the shadows. Caelum's eyes fluttered, groaning as the harsh firelight hit his face. He was waking up and she was entirely exposed. If he saw her human face, if he realized the apothecary he discarded had brought him here, he would try to take command. He would try to force her back to Silver Peak as a prisoner. The panic triggered the change. The white-hot agony swept through her bones in a split second. The cavern echoed with the sickening sound of snapping joints. Caelum pushed himself up onto his elbows, blinking through the haze of the fever. "Who?" he rasped, coughing violently. "Who is there?" A low, chest-vibrating growl answered him. It bounced off the damp walls, surrounding him from all sides. Oraya stepped out of the shadows. She was in her Lycan form again, towering over the firelight. Her silver fur brushed the ceiling of the cave. She lowered her massive head, staring him down with glowing eyes. Caelum froze. The memory of the ravine flooded back into his expression. He tried to project his alpha aura, pushing his chest out and forcing his jaw to clench. "You saved me," he stated, his voice trembling. "I am Alpha Caelum. Tell me what you want." "Gold." Territory? Name your price. Oraya didn't speak. She stepped closer, the ground shaking beneath her heavy footfalls. The sheer, suffocating weight of her dominance crashed into him. Caelum's instincts overrode his pride. His breath hitched, and before he could stop himself he tilted his head to the side, instinctively baring his throat to the superior predator. He hated it. She could see the bitter humiliation flash in his eyes. He, the great king, forced to submit to a nameless beast. Oraya leaned in closer, her muzzle inches from his exposed neck. She let out a hot, heavy breath against his skin. Caelum squeezed his eyes shut, expecting teeth. Instead he inhaled deeply. His eyes snapped open, wild and confused. He recognized the sharp metallic tang of the silver blood dried on the cave floor, a scent he had only smelled once before, sizzling on wet cobblestones in the rain. They left the cavern and pushed back into the biting cold of the Veilwoods. Oraya walked slowly, keeping her massive Lycan frame low enough for Caelum to reach. The dark magic was purged from his veins, but the blood loss left him weak. He stumbled over a rotting log, his heavy boots sinking into the mud. She caught him before he hit the ground, sliding her thick silver-furred shoulder firmly under his arm. Caelum stiffened. He tried to pull away, chest heaving as he fought to maintain his alpha dignity. "I can walk," he grunted, his voice tight with pain. Oraya let out a low, warning rumble. He was lying and they both knew it. Ilara's search parties were swarming the woods. If he fell behind he would die. Slowly, reluctantly, Caelum leaned his weight against her. The physical contact was like throwing dry wood onto a roaring fire. The severed mate bond flared to life. Even through her thick fur, Oraya felt the intense heat of his skin, sending a frantic biological thrill down her spine. The heavy scent of his rain-washed cedar and dark honey flooded her hypersensitive nose, twisting her insides into knots. She hated her body for betraying her mind. She hated how perfectly he fit against her side. They moved in an exhausted rhythm. The brush of wet undergrowth against her fur and his heavy leather coat was the only sound in the dark. Oraya kept her glowing eyes fixed on the treacherous path ahead, refusing to look at him. She could feel his heart beating frantically against her ribs. He was terrified of her yet completely dependent on her. Then Caelum dug his boots into the dirt. He halted, dragging her to a stop. His head tilted up, pushing past the pain. He drew in a long, shaky breath through his nose, tasting the damp forest air. He smelled her. Not the metallic scent of the beast. The delicate, undeniable scent of crushed herbs and pure omega. Heavy rain hammered against the rotting timber roof of the abandoned hunting cabin. Oraya shoved the heavy wooden door shut with her foot, sealing them inside the drafty room. She stepped away from Caelum, letting him collapse onto a broken wooden chair near the dead hearth. He leaned forward, clutching his bandaged thigh, his breath echoing loudly in the cramped space. The air in the cabin grew thick and suffocating. Oraya paced near the window in her towering Lycan form. She kept her back to him, watching the tree line for Ilara's assassins. But she could feel Caelum's eyes boring into her. He wasn't looking at the woods. He was looking at her. "The silver," Caelum whispered. Oraya froze. The blood on the cobblestones, it burned silver. His voice was barely a ragged breath, piecing the fragments together out loud. In the cave, the poultice smelled like the apothecary. "My apothecary." Oraya slowly turned her massive head. Her glowing eyes locked onto his. Caelum gripped the arms of the wooden chair, knuckles turning white. His stoic mask was cracking. He stared at the silver flecks shimmering in her thick fur. He remembered the heavy, crushing silence of the beast who refused to speak a single word. "It's you," he breathed, his voice breaking. "Oraya?" Panic seized her lungs, tight and sharp. The secret was out. The safety of her anonymity was gone. But hot on the heels of the panic came a cold wave of defiance. She was no longer the trembling, banished girl he had thrown into the mud. She let the beast go. The sickening sound of bones snapping and reforming echoed over the rain. She shrank, her silver fur melting away, her jaw snapping back into its fragile human shape. Oraya stood before him in the center of the cabin. She was entirely naked, the cold air biting at her pale skin. But she didn't cross her arms. She didn't cower. She stood tall, chin raised, glaring down at the alpha who had shattered her soul. Caelum shot up from the chair, ignoring the agony in his leg. "Goddess," he choked out, turning his face away and throwing his heavy leather coat toward her. "Cover yourself, Omega." Oraya didn't touch the coat. She let it fall to the dusty floorboards. "You are still of my pack," Caelum commanded, his voice desperate to find its alpha frequency. He turned back, his eyes flashing with ingrained authority. "You will submit to my—" She crossed the room before he could finish. Oraya lunged with blinding Lycan speed. She slammed her human hands into his chest, lifting him clean off his feet. Caelum hit the back wall with a violent, bone-rattling thud. The ancient timber groaned. He gasped, all the air leaving his lungs at once. Oraya pinned him there, her bare forearm pressing hard across his throat. She might be in her human skin, but the ancient power was still humming wildly in her veins. She felt his pulse hammering against her wrist. His eyes were wide, staring down into the furious depths of hers. He had no power here. None. His armies, his titles, his gold, they meant absolutely nothing in this room. She leaned in close. She couldn't speak the words, but her blazing eyes screamed them. "I'm not your Omega. I am not your subject. You hold no authority over me." Caelum's breath hitched. The fight drained out of his broad shoulders. He looked at her bare, shivering skin, then at the ferocious strength pinning him to the wall. The realization washed over him, completely deconstructing his worldview. He had thrown away a queen. His hand came up, trembling, and his fingers brushed softly against her bare waist. A gesture not of command but of total surrender. Then the heavy wooden door of the cabin blew completely off its hinges. The heavy wooden door splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. A concussive blast of dark magic threw Oraya backward. She hit the floorboards hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. The ruined doorway was instantly engulfed in roaring green flames. Through the smoke, Illyra's elite guards poured into the cabin, their crossbows raised and leveled directly at Caelum. He was still pressed against the wall, defenseless, his eyes wide against the sudden inferno. "Kill the Alpha," a guard shouted over the roar of the fire. Oraya didn't think about the betrayal. She didn't think about the rain-soaked cobblestones or the severed tether. She only saw the man her soul claimed as hers about to die. The agonizing crack of bone drowned out the crackling flames. She vaulted across the room, her human skin ripping away as the towering silver-furred beast exploded outward. She landed squarely in front of Caelum just as the violent thwip-thwip-thwip of crossbows filled the cabin. Most of the bolts shattered harmlessly against her impenetrable Lycan muscle. But one didn't. A searing, blinding agony punched through her right shoulder. It wasn't normal steel. It was pure, refined silver. A lethal, illegal metal designed exclusively to burn shifter blood. Oraya let out a deafening roar of agony. The silver burned like liquid fire, melting through her flesh, neutralizing the ancient magic in her veins. Her massive legs buckled. "Oraya!" Caelum screamed, his voice tearing completely. Unadulterated terror radiated from his scent. The elite guards reloaded, stepping closer into the burning room. The floorboards beneath them groaned under the intense heat and the crushing weight of Oraya's Lycan form. She slammed her heavy, taloned fist into the weakened timber below her. The floor gave way with a violent snap. The ancient wood collapsed entirely, plunging Oraya, Caelum, and a tidal wave of burning debris down into the pitch-black void of the old smuggler tunnels beneath the cabin. The crash knocked the breath from her lungs a second time. Oraya hit the cold stone floor of the tunnel. The impact jolted the silver arrow lodged deep in her shoulder. A fresh wave of white-hot torture screamed through her nervous system. She thrashed in the darkness, her Lycan form violently rejecting the toxic metal. The silver was forcing her magic to recede. With a sickening crunch, she shrank, collapsing back into her fragile human form. She curled into a tight ball on the freezing stone, gasping silently for air. Her blood felt like acid. The suffocating darkness of the tunnel was broken only by the faint, echoing drips of underground water. "Oraya. Goddess, no. Please." Hands found her in the dark. Frantic, trembling hands. Caelum crawled over the rubble, dragging his injured leg. He found her bare shoulders, his fingers slipping on the warm blood pouring from her wound. He pulled her up against his chest. His heart was hammering a chaotic, terrified rhythm. "I have to pull it out," Caelum rasped, his breath hot against her ear. It's pure silver. It's killing you. Hold on to me. Oraya bit down hard on her own lip, tasting copper. She gripped the heavy leather of his coat with weak fingers. She nodded once. Caelum wrapped his hand around the slick, bloody shaft of the arrow. He braced his arm. Forgive me. He ripped the silver out. The sickening squelch of tearing flesh echoed off the damp walls. Oraya's back arched off the stone, her mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream. She buried her face into Caelum's neck, going entirely limp as the dark magic finally left her veins. I have you, Caelum choked out. I have you. She felt something hot and wet drop onto her bare shoulder. Then another. Oraya opened her exhausted eyes. Caelum was rocking her slowly in the dark. The stoic, ruthless alpha of Silver Peak was sobbing. The perfect mask of control was completely shattered. He buried his face in her hair, his tears mixing with the dirt and blood on her skin. Do not die, he begged, his voice a broken whisper. Please. I was a fool. I was so afraid of failing them I threw away my soul. Please don't leave me. Slowly, Oraya lifted her trembling, blood-stained hand. She pressed her palm gently against his wet, stubbled cheek. Caelum leaned into her touch, burying his lips against her palm as he wept. The freezing dampness of the deep tunnels began to seep into her bones. They had dragged themselves further into the dark, away from the collapsed ceiling and the smoke. Caelum had wrapped her tightly in his heavy leather coat, pulling her directly into his lap. He sat with his back against the curved stone wall, his arms locked securely around her waist, trapping every ounce of his burning body heat against her shivering frame. The raw, bleeding edges of their trauma began to soften. Oraya rested her head against his chest. She could hear the steady thud of his heart beneath the thin fabric of his tunic. The scent of rain-washed cedar surrounded her, no longer spiked with terror or authority, but rich with absolute protective devotion. She felt a strange, terrifying sense of safety. The walls she had built around her heart were crumbling in the dark. Oraya shifted slightly. She reached out from beneath the heavy coat, her index finger resting against the center of Caelum's chest, right over his heart. She pressed down slightly and began to trace a shape. W. Y. Caelum's breath hitched. He rested his chin on the top of her head, pulling her just a fraction closer. Because my parents died trusting the wrong pack, he whispered, his voice thick with exhaustion and shame. I swore I'd never let love blind me. I thought Alara's army was the only way to keep our borders safe. I chose logic over the goddess. He swallowed hard. And I ruined everything. Oraya let her hand rest flat against his racing heart. She traced one more word into his tunic. Chobu. I will fix it, Caelum swore, the vibration of his deep voice rumbling against her cheek. If we survive this night, I'll spend the rest of my life on my knees until you forgive me. I will burn the world to keep you safe. The air in the tunnel grew heavy with unspoken promises. The magnetic pull of the mate bond hummed between their skin, binding them in the pitch black. Oraya closed her eyes, letting herself lean fully into his embrace. Then the stone wall behind them vibrated violently. A low, deafening rumble echoed from the surface above, raining dust down onto their hair. Oraya's eyes snapped open. The ground shook again, harder this time. It wasn't the cabin collapsing. It was the sound of ancient trees falling. Alara wasn't just searching for them anymore. She was destroying the Veilwoods. The vibrations rattled Oraya's teeth. She pushed herself out of Caelum's arms, the heavy leather coat slipping from her bare shoulders. The silver wound still burned with a dull ache, but the bleeding had stopped. The ancient Lycan magic was already knitting her torn muscles back together, stubbornly refusing to let her die. They navigated the pitch-black tunnels entirely by touch. Oraya led the way, following the faint draft of cold, ash-tainted air blowing down from the surface. Caelum limped close behind her, his hand resting lightly on her waist to guide himself in the dark. They finally pushed aside a rusted iron grate, stepping out into the freezing night air. They stood on a high rocky outcropping overlooking the valley. The Veilwoods behind them were a roaring wall of unnatural green fire. But that wasn't what made Oraya's breath catch in her throat. Below them, the great keep of Silver Peak was under siege. The scent of burning thatch and terrified blood drifted up the cliffside. Alara's shadow assassins swarmed the packed square, dragging men, women, and children out of their homes. Loyalists were being beaten into the mud. The proud fortress Caelum had sacrificed his soul to protect was burning from the inside out. Caelum stumbled forward, falling to his knees on the edge of the cliff. "No," he breathed. His voice was completely hollow. "Goddess, no." He gripped his hair, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he watched his people bleed. "This is my fault," he rasped, the scent of his despair thickening the air. "I traded my soul to save them, and I burned my own home." Oraya stared down at the carnage. A cold, absolute wrath settled deep into her bones. The fear she had carried her entire life, the trembling, silent Omega hiding from the world, was gone. In its place was the freezing calm of a sovereign. She stepped in front of Caelum. She didn't reach down to comfort him. Instead, she tapped her chest firmly with 2 fingers, catching his tear-filled eyes. Then she pointed directly down toward the central pack plaza. He was going in. And she was going in alone. The beast returned. The agonizing, beautiful crack of bones snapping into place echoed off the cliffside. Oraya shed her fragile human skin, her massive silver-furred Lycan form rising out of the shadows. The silver arrow had slowed her, but it hadn't broken her. She breathed in the smoke and ash, letting the sheer terrifying power of her bloodline completely take over. She descended the cliff face in total silence, dropping from rock to rock with the lethal grace of a falling shadow. Caelum followed behind her, limping but resolute. He didn't issue commands. He didn't try to take the lead. The Alpha of Silver Peak was entirely submitting to her tactical command. They reached the darkened alleyways on the outskirts of the pack square. "Perimeter guards," Caelum whispered, pointing to 2 heavy-set wolves patrolling the cobblestones ahead. "If they sound the alarm, the plaza will swarm us." Oraya let out a soft, dismissive huff of air through her nose. She melted into the shadows along the stone wall. She didn't run. She simply ceased to exist in the light. She slipped entirely unnoticed behind the first guard, her massive black talons wrapping gently around his neck. A sharp twist. A muffled thud. The second guard spun around, drawing his blade, but Oraya was already above him. She dropped heavily from the low roof, her immense weight driving him instantly to the cobblestones. She silenced his shout with a heavy, silver-furred hand over his mouth, crushing his sternum with her knee. She rose from the bodies, turning her glowing eyes back to Caelum. He stared at her from the mouth of the alley, his chest heaving. There was no fear left in his scent. Only a blinding, overwhelming reverence for the deadly, beautiful monster she had become. A woman's cruel laughter pierced the night air. It came from the center of the plaza. "Alara." Oraya's ears pinned flat against her massive skull. She stepped out from the shadows of the alley, moving directly toward the blazing braziers of the square. The light of the fires hit her silver fur. Oraya stepped fully into the pack plaza, her heavy cobblestones clicking under her thick black talons. This was the exact spot where she had been thrown to the mud. This was where her soul had been severed. The screaming in the square abruptly stopped. 50 of Alara's elite warriors stood in a tight perimeter around the center of the plaza. Every single one of them froze, their eyes locking onto the towering nightmare stepping out of the dark. In the center of the circle, Alara sat upon Caelum's wooden throne. Before her, the elders of Silver Peak were forced onto their knees in the wet dirt, poisoned blades resting casually against their throats. "Well, well," Alara sneered, standing up from the throne. She didn't look afraid. She looked deeply, dangerously amused. The exiled freak finally shows her true colors. Caelum stepped out of the alleyway, taking his place directly behind Oraya's massive shoulder. He was unarmed, bleeding and stripped of his coat, but he stood tall. Alara's smirk widened. "You survived the poison, Caelum. Impressive. But you brought a dumb, mutated beast to fight an army." She raised her hand, casually signaling her warriors. "Did you really think a monster could save your crown?" 50 steel blades were drawn in perfect, terrifying unison. The harsh shink of metal echoed off the stone walls. The elders squeezed their eyes shut, weeping silently. It was a flawless trap. They were entirely surrounded, severely outnumbered and backed against the alleyway walls. "Kill the elders first," Alara commanded, her voice ringing with sadistic joy. "Let the Alpha watch his pack die before we put him out of his misery." Oraya didn't retreat. She didn't look at the 50 blades. She stepped directly in front of Caelum, her massive shoulders widening as she planted her clawed feet firmly into the stone. She closed her glowing eyes. She felt the agonizing pressure building tight in her throat, the lifelong curse of her silence, the decades of swallowed screams and unvoiced pain. She focused every ounce of her ancient magic, every drop of her burning silver blood, directly into her chest. Her massive lungs expanded, pulling in all the air in the plaza. The executioners raised their poisoned blades high above the weeping elders. Oraya watched the deadly steel gleam in the firelight. She felt the decades of absolute silence, every swallowed cry from her childhood, every suffocated plea from her exile, every unspoken truth she had been forced to bury, boil over into a white-hot rage. She was done hiding. She was done being the victim of a world that demanded her silence. Her massive lungs burned as she drew in the smoke-filled air. The mental block that had chained her vocal cords since birth strained violently. It felt like a thick iron collar wrapping tight around her windpipe, suffocating her from the inside out. But the ancient Lycan magic surging through her silver blood was stronger than any curse. She pushed the magic upward. She pushed with every ounce of her shattered soul. It felt as if her throat was literally tearing wide open. A searing, blinding pressure built behind her teeth. Oraya threw her massive silver-furred head back toward the storm-filled sky and unleashed a sound that hadn't been heard on the earth for 1,000 years. It wasn't a mere scream. It wasn't a simple wolf's howl. It was a physical shockwave of pure sonic power. The literal Lycan roar tore through the pack plaza, violently distorting the very air around her. Shatter. Every single glass pane in the towering stone keep exploded outward simultaneously, raining a glittering cascade of shards down onto the cobblestones. The stone plaza beneath her heavy black talons violently fractured, webbing with deep, jagged fissures that crawled rapidly toward the edges of the square. The 50 elite warriors never stood a chance. The sonic blast hit them like a solid, moving wall of stone. They were thrown completely backward through the air, their heavy boots lifting off the ground as their poisoned weapons spun uselessly into the dark. They crashed hard into the alley walls and the mud, clutching the sides of their heads as dark blood poured freely from their shattered eardrums. The executioners were blasted away from the terrified elders, their armored bodies tumbling violently across the wet stone. The earth-shattering roar echoed out past the boundary wards, rolling into the burning Veilwoods, silencing the howling wind, and vibrating through the marrow of every living creature for miles. Oraya slowly snapped her massive jaws shut, her chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. A breathless, ringing stillness settled over the ruined plaza. She looked down at her silver-furred hands, the adrenaline singing a fiery, electric song in her veins. She had spoken. The collar was broken. She was finally, truly awake. Ilara slowly pushed herself up from the dirt, her expensive velvet cloak ruined and heavy with mud. Her beautiful, mocking face was completely twisted into a mask of pure fury. She looked around the plaza at her 50 elite warriors groaning on the ground, bleeding and deafened. The dark magic in her veins flared violently, surrounding her skin in a sickly toxic green haze that smelled of rotting leaves and ozone. "You stupid, worthless anomaly!" Ilara shrieked, the sound grating and desperately shrill. "I am the true Alpha. I am the ruler of this territory." Ilara's human bones violently snapped. She didn't shift with the fluid, natural grace of a true wolf. The dark magic tore her human flesh apart, forcibly expanding her into a massive, unnatural dire wolf. Her fur was pitch black and matted, her eyes glowing with toxic malice. She was huge, nearly the size of a Lycan, but her scent lacked the ancient divine purity of the moon goddess. She smelled only of ambition and poison. Ilara lunged across the fractured stones, her massive, saliva-dripping jaws snapping directly for Oraya's throat. Oraya didn't dodge. She didn't brace for impact. She met the charge head-on with devastating, unstoppable momentum. The bone-jarring impact of their massive bodies colliding echoed like a thunderclap across the silent square. The sheer force sent a tremor through the cobblestones. Ilara's dark jaws clamped down hard on Oraya's uninjured shoulder, the dire wolf's teeth seeking to tear thick Lycan muscle from bone. Oraya felt the sharp, stinging puncture of teeth, but she felt absolutely no fear. The pain was nothing compared to the cobblestones. She was the sovereign of these woods and she would not be moved. She reached up with both hands, her thick black talons sinking deep into the matted scruff of Alara's neck. With a terrifying guttural snarl that rattled her own ribs, Oraya physically ripped the massive dire wolf off her body. She twisted her torso and slammed Alara violently into the stone floor. The plaza shook. Alara thrashed wildly, trying to bite, trying to rake her claws across Oraya's stomach, but Oraya pinned her entirely. She pressed one massive silver-furred forearm directly across Alara's windpipe, crushing the breath out of the false alpha's lungs. Oraya leaned down, her elongated muzzle inches from the frantic glowing green eyes of her enemy. She opened her jaws. She bypassed the animal growls and reached deep into her newly awakened soul, finding the precise shape of human words. When she finally spoke, her voice was a double-layered, ethereal vibration that resonated directly in the chest of everyone present. Kneel. The single word carried the absolute, undeniable weight of ancient authority. Alara's massive spine forcefully bowed backward. The dark dire wolf whimpered in pure agony, her physical body completely compelled by a magic far older and stronger than her petty poison. She stopped thrashing instantly. She went completely limp beneath Oraya's crushing weight, her throat entirely bared in ultimate submission. Oraya slowly stood up, releasing the physical suffocating pin from Alara's throat. The black dire wolf remained trapped on the cold stone, completely immobilized by the sheer force of the verbal command. She trembled violently, the toxic green magic flickering and dying rapidly around her dark fur like a suffocated candle. Oraya made her final choice. She could easily tear Alara's throat out. She could paint these very cobblestones with the hot blood of the woman who had mocked her existence, who had eagerly stolen her fated mate, who had just tried to burn an entire pack of innocents to ashes. The beast inside her demanded a lethal vengeance. It would be so incredibly easy to end her life right here. But Oraya was not a mindless, bloodthirsty monster. She was an apothecary. She was a healer. She was a queen. She stepped delicately over the shivering, defeated dire wolf, her massive presence demanding absolute attention from the terrified, bleeding elders watching from the dirt. You mocked the anomalies of the world, Oraya spoke again, her resonant voice echoing beautifully across the fractured plaza. You built your throne entirely on stolen power, political lies, and dark poison. Oraya raised her massive, silver-furred right hand. She leaned down and placed her open palm directly onto the center of Alara's broad, dark forehead. I strip you of your fangs, Oraya decreed, her dual-layered voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that carried through the damp night air. I sever your spirit from the goddess. You will live the rest of your miserable days exactly as you forced me to live, entirely powerless and entirely voiceless. A high-pitched, mystical ringing sound pierced the air. It was the sickening metaphysical sound of a soul shattering into pieces. A pure flash of silver light erupted directly from Oraya's palm, engulfing the dire wolf. Alara let out a choked, suffocated gasp of ultimate horror. The massive black wolf form rapidly deteriorated beneath Oraya's touch, shrinking, cracking, and melting away until absolutely nothing was left but a fragile human woman curled naked and shivering on the wet stone. Alara frantically grabbed her own throat, her mouth opening and closing in silent, desperate panic. No sound came out. The wolf was gone. The dark magic was completely burned away. She was entirely empty. Alara collapsed heavily against the cold earth, her frail human shoulders heaving as she began to sob, a quiet, pathetic, utterly broken human weeping. Oraya turned away from the ruined usurper. He felt no pity. She turned her glowing silver eyes across the ruined square, searching through the settling dust and the kneeling pack members. Her gaze locked instantly onto Caelum. He was still standing completely still near the mouth of the alleyway. His broad chest was rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He was staring back at her, his dark eyes wide with an emotion so deep it anchored her soul, a solitary figure standing amidst the smoking wreckage of his fallen kingdom. The false queen was handled. The real judgment was just about to begin. The heavy, metallic scent of ozone and spilled blood hung thick over the ruined cobblestones. Oraya stood in the center of the pack plaza, her towering silver-furred body perfectly still against the backdrop of the smoldering keep. The toxic green haze of Alara's dark magic was entirely gone. The only light left came from the shattered, flickering braziers and the pale glow of the moon breaking through the storm clouds. She lowered her massive head, her breath curling into thick white plumes in the freezing air. The surviving members of the Silver Peak pack began to emerge from the shadows of the alleyways. They stepped slowly over the unconscious bodies of the elite warriors. They didn't raise their weapons. They didn't bare their teeth. They stared at her. Oraya watched them through glowing, silver eyes. These were the people who had tolerated her silence, who had whispered behind her back, who had stood by and done absolutely nothing while she was violently banished into the mud. The beast inside her chest rumbled with a dark, lingering bitterness. She could crush them all. She could rule this territory with a heavy, merciless hand. An ancient, gray-haired pack elder stepped forward into the light. He was bleeding from a shallow cut on his cheek, his fine robes torn from the siege. He looked up at the towering Lycan queen. He looked at the shattered glass, the fractured earth, and the weeping, powerless usurper curled in the dirt. He didn't see a monster. He saw the ancient wrath of the moon goddess herself. The elder closed his eyes, let out a long, trembling breath, and dropped heavily to his knees. He tilted his head back, entirely exposing his fragile throat to the night air. It was the undisputed posture of total submission. The sound of his knees hitting the stone echoed like a gunshot. It started a tidal wave. Behind him, a mother pulled her child down onto the wet cobblestones. Then a perimeter guard dropped his sword and fell to the earth. One by one, row by row, the people of Silver Peak sank to the ground. The collective sound of hundreds of knees striking the fractured stone rolled through the plaza like a deep, rhythmic heartbeat. Within seconds, the entire surviving pack was kneeling in the dirt, their heads bowed, their throats bared to the woman they had thrown away. Oraya felt the overwhelming weight of their collective awe washing over her senses. The fear was gone. The isolation was gone. She was recognized. The crowd parted slowly, leaving a single wide path down the center of the square. At the far end of the plaza, only one man remained standing. Alpha Caelum stepped forward into the moonlight. His heavy leather coat was gone, left behind in the burning tunnels. His dark tunic was soaked with rain and stained with his own blood. He limped heavily on his bandaged leg, but he didn't stop. He walked straight down the center of the kneeling pack, his dark eyes locked entirely on Oraya's glowing gaze. The heavy scent of rain-washed cedar and dark honey flooded her senses. It was no longer spiked with the rigid, suffocating control of an alpha. It smelled of raw, agonizing vulnerability. Caelum stopped exactly 3 paces in front of her massive clawed feet. He looked up at her towering, silver-furred form. He saw the raw power in her heavy muscles. He saw the lethal black talons that had just shattered an army. And he saw the beautiful, fierce soul of the apothecary he had betrayed. He didn't speak a command. He didn't demand his throne. Caelum closed his eyes, his broad shoulders trembling, and he dropped heavily to his knees. The splash of cold mud stained his trousers, mirroring the exact posture she had been forced into just hours before. But Caelum wasn't being pushed. He was falling willingly. He bowed his head low, resting his palms flat against the wet, fractured cobblestones. "I was a coward," Caelum spoke. His voice was a deep, broken rasp that carried perfectly through the silent square. "I thought a crown meant saving my people. I thought an alliance would buy us peace. But all I did was shatter the only true sacred thing the goddess ever gave me." Oraya felt the phantom ache of the severed tether burning wildly in her chest. She took one heavy, earth-shaking step forward, looming directly over him. "I don't ask for my pack back," Caelum continued, a single hot tear slipping down his bruised cheek and splashing onto the stone. "I don't ask for my title. I renounce my claim to Silver Peak." He lifted his head, his dark, desperate eyes entirely raw and unprotected. "I only ask for your judgment, my queen," he whispered, his voice cracking completely. "My life is yours. My blood is yours. I'll serve you in the shadows or I'll die by your claws. But I will never, ever turn my back on you again." The total, unconditional surrender echoed in the quiet night. The great king had completely deconstructed his own ego. He had laid his entire existence at the feet of the anomaly. Oraya closed her glowing eyes, letting out a long, heavy breath that stirred the dust around Caelum's kneeling form. She didn't want his blood. She didn't want his servitude. She only wanted the man beneath the crown. The agonizing snap of bones and tearing muscle didn't return. This time the shift was a fluid, deeply relieving release of pressure. The towering silver beast melted away like mist in the moonlight, shrinking, softening, and smoothing back into her fragile, shivering human skin. Oraya stood before him on the wet cobblestones, draped only in the oversized, blood-stained wool coat from the tunnels. She was small again. He was human. But she didn't feel weak. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. Caelum's breath hitched as her bare toes touched his muddy knees. He didn't dare to reach out. He stayed frozen entirely at her mercy, waiting for her verdict. Oraya slowly reached down. She slid her warm, trembling hands under his jaw, her thumbs brushing against the rough stubble of his cheeks. She tilted his face up to meet hers. She opened her mouth. The heavy iron collar of her lifelong silence was shattered. "Caelum," she whispered. Her real voice was soft, slightly raspy from decades of disuse, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Caelum let out a wrecked, suffocated sob at the sound of his name on her lips. His heavy arms came up, wrapping fiercely around her waist, burying his face directly into her stomach as he wept openly into the damp wool of her coat. "You are my mate," Oraya spoke, her voice growing steadier, richer, echoing with quiet authority. She firmly gripped his shoulders, pulling upward. "Not my king. And I am not your servant." Caelum let her pull him to his feet. He towered over her human form, but his posture was completely devoted, his eyes shining with absolute reverent awe. "We rise together," Oraya commanded softly. She rose onto her toes, sliding her hands deep into his damp, dark hair and pulled his lips down to hers. The kiss was searing and desperate. Caelum's strong arms crushed her tightly against his chest, lifting her slightly off the ground as if he were terrified she would vanish. The burning, undeniable heat of his skin chased the freezing cold completely out of her bones. Deep in the metaphysical space between their souls, a massive explosion of light erupted. The severed spiritual tether violently, triumphantly snapped back into place. It didn't just reconnect. It fused, burning thicker and stronger than before, locking their souls together with an unbreakable, permanent seal. A roaring, deafening cheer erupted from the kneeling pack, filling the night air with absolute victory. Oraya pulled back just enough to look into Caelum's eyes, her own reflecting the pale light of the moon. They stood together in the center of the ruined square, no longer alpha and outcast, but sovereign equals, ready to rebuild a kingdom from the ashes.